I'm Celia Knight. I'm a biologist. I think that's what I call myself now. But I'm massively interested in plants. I actually started my academic life as a microbiologist. I did microbiology at Bristol University. But before that I'd worked as a lab technician for Glaxo's. So, I've had a checkered sort of route into academia. And I first got to love research by my final year research project, where I looked at, in fact, the fungal infection Gamenomyces graminis with wheat. So I got into plant microbe interactions then. And after my degree, fired by enthusiasm for research, I wasn't quite sure about a PhD, but I was lucky enough to get a research job at the John Innes Institute. Wow. And I worked on rhizobium legume symbiosis. So that got me into plants, and after 3 years of that, I thought, hey, I want to do my own research. So I then applied to do a PhD at the University of Leeds on the moss Viscomatrella patens. And I managed to stay there, postdoc and lecturer, up to senior lecturer for a further 23 or so years. So that has been my academic career. But in the latter time of that, I got very worried about where the new generation of plant scientists was going to come from. And fortunately, responded to an advert from the Gatsby Foundation coming up to 20 years ago to start a summer school. In the 2000s, and in fact I wrote a little bit about this, I have a daughter who was in her teens in the 2000s, and I realised, frankly, her mum working on moss was a bit of an embarrassment to her, and no one at her school inspired her about plants, that was clear. And she wasn't unique in that sense, and there was a real concern amongst academia, a real concern around that time that botany, plant science degrees were closing or just not attracting interest. There was a real concern that we weren't firing up the next generation to have enough experience about plant science to be able to meet the needs which are now very clear to us. And all credit to Gatsby, the Gatsby Foundation, for realising that this is what we needed to do. And in fact, their whole process of offering PhD studentships and Sainsbury undergraduate studentships, which still exists and need to still exist, wasn't doing enough. It wasn't getting the volume through excitedly enough. And so the Gatsby Plant Science Advisors said we need something at first year undergraduate level. And here is where the really clever bit came, because by creating this summer school to attract good minds across a whole range of disciplines, what was possible was to show first-year undergraduates that plant science was both exciting, much needed, and offered a plethora of career opportunities. So I saw this advert and I thought, yes please, I can do that. Because I had the experience of what undergraduates liked and what they didn't like. And I'm going to be frank, what they didn't like was only modules that focused on Arabidopsis genetics. For obvious reasons, there's more to plant science than Arabidopsis. However, what we now know, the Arabidopsis effort that happened over those decades is enabling an enormous amount of much needed research and translational effort. So that's where we were in the 2000s, and with Gatsby's support, we had the opportunity to offer something special. It had to be special, otherwise we wouldn't attract the people that we wanted to. And so the venue was extremely important. We started off in 2005 at Bretton Hall, in fact, which is part of the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. And it being run through the University of Leeds, that was very good effort. And unfortunately, that venue was not available after 2 years. So with much effort and with much support from two people I had working with me, Aurora Leavesley and Juliet Jobson, we found the Hawk Hills. We've been at the Hawk Hills now for, this is the 16th year, it's just phenomenal. As you know, it creates the environment for space and reflection. The programme covers a breadth of exciting science. It allows students to be excited by the science, but to have time to reflect and question and learn how to question. So first year undergraduates really, they don't get that much opportunity for practicing that. Universities have big intakes. We're now half online. It's the way the world has gone. So this experience just allows them to absorb, breathe, reflect, and come up with things that work for them to follow. And there's no assessment. That's really, really important. And that's why it's worked for the number of years that it has. It's got to be current, it's got to have the best presenters, because not all experts are the best presenters, though, that is a fact. And a really important element is to be kind to students and to understand where they're coming from as first-year undergraduates. And I'm very conscious still of how much pressure there is on students to make the right decision. And many of the students who come here are good at lots of things, and that's partly their dilemma, which shall I follow to make a good career. I always say to them, there comes a time where you've got to be prepared to leave some things to one side. If it's important, they'll come back in again. Passion is an overused term sometimes, but it's very important for students at this stage of their career, I think, to follow a question that they're interested in. No one knows where that's going to lead. I had no idea when I started working on some MOS questions that I would end up running or starting a summer school for undergraduates. But I knew how to recognise when one was needed. So be kind to students, and I always say to them, don't rush. There are boats leaving all the time. Decide, take the opportunity as an undergraduate to absorb, question, and then seek advice on, is this a good area to follow? Because that's exactly what the Gatsby network is able to help students with. If they come with a question that they're interested in, we can then support them in finding out how they can further that level of expertise. And then if you talk to any academic or any more senior people, most people didn't know where they are going to be, where they were going to end up where they are now. So, the majority of my academic career was working on moss, and I have to say this is moss in a petri dish in the laboratory as opposed to moss out in the environment, although I'm a great supporter of finding it in its natural habitat. But the reason it was important and has been worked on by a large number of people is it's a model system, and it has haploid genetics for most of its developmental pathway. And so it's much easier than many angiosperms or other species to follow the genetics of development. And it's important that that is done in more than one species. Of course, Arabidopsis is extremely valuable for answering that question, but it can be done in other systems as well. So at the time that I started working on moss, I was interested in the gravitropic response because it's a tip-growing filamentous cell system, and it was a delight to be able to look at a complex cell growing by tip extension and using genetic analysis to do that. So I did a number of mutant studies and also microscopy on it. Gravitropism is an important and often overlooked stimulus that plants respond to. And if we think about the above ground plants that you see, in most cases they are responding to light so that they can photosynthesize. But of course light isn't always available, and in most cases the response to gravity, which is a much more constant stimulus, kicks in to be able to allow the plant to not change its growth direction. That's a very simplistic view of why gravity is important. But in addition, so the fact that plants have a response to gravity means it is very interesting to use that as the stimulus to understand how it perceives gravity, how that signal is transduced to the molecules that will effect a change in growth direction. So it's a relatively simple environmental stimulus to study.